Well, this is all very well, but as you can guess, and as you've seen, this is a little bit more stressful than your average public service interpreting assignment. Why is that? Well, look what happens to the survivors. Hopefully this is not every day, although in a hospital you can be seeing a lot of grim events and patients in terrible condition. Outside of a hospital, you don't tend to see injuries very much like the ones you see here, and these are all real. And look at the psychological effects, the shame, the sadness and depression, the anger. You never know what you're going to get when you walk in the door. She might have just been raped that evening, and she's giggling. Or once when I was an advocate, and twice I interpreted, by the way, the advocate should never interpret, but I didn't know because I wasn't trained to interpret at the time. Once I had a 16-year-old rape victim, and she was insulting the nurse who was doing her exam. This nurse who wasn't even on call, she'd been called from a party because the nurse on call wasn't available. And this 16-year-old is making snide remarks about how her mascara looks like spiders. Expect anything from a survivor of gender-based violence, especially if the violence has just occurred. There is no scripted response for a survivor. And you may think, oh, I really don't want to be here. Any other moment but this one, because you're hearing things that you didn't know one human being could do to another human being in the more extreme cases. I'm not saying every case. And whatever happens to the survivor could also potentially happen to you, the interpreter, if you don't take good care of yourself. And things like post-traumatic stress disorder, if you're familiar with that syndrome, where you can relive the event in your body, not just your mind. That can happen to you. One interpreter said, you know, I went home and I started having these dreams of what happened to the survivor. It was like I was having her own dreams for her. You take it away if you're not careful. You do not want to take this away. Look at all the things that are happening to the survivors on the cognitive level, psychologically, physically, spiritually, relationally. The service providers have been trained how to deal with this, but we're only now waking up to the fact that we have to deal with interpreters, and we have to protect interpreters by training them too. Possible client emotional and behavioral reactions, jumping about. You're expecting a typical interaction. The service provider is trying to get a chronological story, A, B, C, D, E, from the beginning point to the end point, whether it's a lawyer, a police officer, sometimes even a therapist, but they're actually more in tune, they're more able to cope. But how do you make sense of it even when they jump from subject to subject? A lot of interpreters clean that up. Don't clean it up. You want them to speak in whatever way you want. And if it's incoherent, you just try. It's really hard to interpret incoherence. You just do the best that you can so that it doesn't come out in nice, clean sentences, but reflects what is really said. Now, how often in community interpreting are you sitting interpreting when suddenly the client just goes like this, and their eyes glaze over, and they're somewhere else, and the service provider, if they have clinical training, knows emotionally where that survivor is. But what do? Silence falls. 2 minutes, 3 minutes. Were you trained to sit with silence? Probably not. It feels really weird. So we have interpreters who kind of cough and they shuffle papers and clear their throat. Like, shouldn't somebody be doing something? No. You just sit, take a breather, in other words, take a break, and then when somebody speaks, you're back on the job. You are back on the job interpreting. So these are just things that nobody is training you typically in regular interpreter training, or that's what we find. So there's a few things you need to be careful of. Remind yourself that you're there to interpret, not to help, not to fix, not to take care of the survivor, to interpret. Deep breathing, not from your throat, which is bad for your interpreting anyway, especially if you're feeling emotional. Deep from here, from your diaphragm. If you breathe deeply, that will get you through a lot, but you have to remember to do that, and you forget because it's so emotional. Focusing on a physical location in the room. Or even, if you're sitting down, the chair underneath you, the feet. One therapist says, you've always got toes. Wiggle your toes so that you're grounding yourself. Always watch out for cues from the provider who may know what's going on and be trying to give you subtle indications to guide you. Again, never touch, no matter what, no matter what, no matter what. And here's one. So you may have been taught memory skills techniques, like in the United States, that include visualization. Do not visualize traumatic content. That will be problematic and even potentially painful or harmful for you. Visualize a beach, visualize a nice, safe place that you like if you need to visualize, but not what you're interpreting. And one of the things the providers have asked you to do, if at all possible, part of your self-care plan, is develop techniques to stay calm. Because this is very intense, as I keep saying, and if you get intense too, you can potentially escalate the situation, which we've already made clear you don't want to do. So that self-care plan, as important as it is for all interpreters, is much more important for you to help you stay calm. And maybe for some interpreters, just remembering that the difference they're making for that survivor to have her voice is already calming in and of itself, because it's such a gift to the survivor. Notes, very concrete. Take more notes than you need to if it helps you ground yourself so that you're focusing on the linguistic aspect and not the emotional aspect. Again, we said switch to third person if you need to temporarily. And we've already said don't escalate when you render emotion, but you may need to take it down even some more. In other words, don't interpret too much emotional tone if you're starting to feel it yourself. Watch out for that. And use your facial expressions and body language to show how focused you are on the message. Survivors want to be heard if they feel safe enough to share their story. That's huge. That's huge, and they can't do it without you. So we teach techniques like grounding and abdominal breathing and imagery, some of the things we mentioned. We actually teach the interpreters how to do these things and to be aware of that impact always. If you start to notice that you're having nightmares, that you're afraid of the parking lot, that you're suddenly more protective of your children if you interpret for child abuse, these are signs that you need to do something. Even get counseling or therapy yourself. There's no shame for interpreters in getting that help. But we also know that you need to write a wellness plan. So we teach you how to do that. Now, here's a typical wellness plan in the United States. I'm going to exercise more. Yeah, well, we're all going to exercise more, right? That's not a wellness plan. So part of it is knowing how to write objectives that are real, that are meaningful, that actually will help you. And if it isn't fun, if it isn't relaxing, that's not going to help you. That's not a wellness plan. That's a self-punishment plan. So how do you do that? So you focus on behavior, performance, and conditions. And it looks like this. What is the action? Now, we'll take exercise, but you don't actually like the gym. That's not good. But you like walking. So, okay, I'm going to walk. Well, that's good. That's a start, but that's pretty vague. I'm going to walk. When? How often? How long? Okay, well, I'll walk in the evening. How often? I'm pretty busy. Twice a week. How long? I'll walk in the evening twice a week for half an hour. And research has showed that if you write these things down, there's a much greater likelihood that you'll actually do it. And then the context. So how is this taking place? I'll walk in the evening twice a week for half an hour with my friend Dolores in the park. Now you have an objective, a real objective. And so you write your whole wellness plan like that. And we train the interpreters how to do that because it's an integral part of self-care. And to do it short-term, intermediate, long-term objectives. So things that you figure out what works for you, not for any other interpreter, but what works for you. And then you write the objectives, and that's how you create your wellness plan. It has to be that specific. But there's something else that is hugely important if you can get it, and that's a debrief. So this is where Maria Jesus, my wonderful therapist, is going to demonstrate. Yeah, she took a crash course in how to be a therapist, about 5 minutes. She's now an expert, of course. And you're going to do this role play, so please pay attention. It's pretty straightforward. You're not going to get lawyers to do this, by the way. Good luck on that one, unless your Spanish lawyers are very special. You may get it with a social worker. You're lucky if you can get it with a nurse. With a therapist, and those are often the most intense sessions, they know how to do this. I'm sure even in Spain, they know how to debrief with you. So here's the idea. The interpreter is just going to answer honestly. So I'll demonstrate. No script, no script. I saw you interpreters reading the script. Not this time, because there is no script. All right. So the therapist here knows, Maria Jesus knows how to debrief even interpreters. She's got the script. This has been an intense session, and the client even burst out screaming in the middle of the session. And you weren't expecting that, because that doesn't usually happen when you interpret. And the therapist has noticed. So the therapist, you could ask for the debrief, the therapist could notice and do one for you, but probably you'll have to ask. And the therapist is now going to do the script, and I'm just going to answer like this really happened to me, like I just interpreted for that session.
Well, Marjory, I found this session to be very intense today. I found it very difficult when the client screamed and had trouble breathing.
I'm so sorry. You want to start over?
Did you hear me?
Let's start over.
Marjory, I found this session to be very intense today. I found it very difficult when the client screamed and had trouble breathing. What was this session like for you?
It was pretty intense. I haven't done much of this kind of interpreting before, and yeah, I admit I was kind of off my game.
It sounds like these were pretty powerful feelings for you. If it's any help, that can happen to me too. It's normal for therapists and for anyone really to have strong feelings when those kinds of reactions come up.
Yeah, well, she was screaming, and my stomach actually seized up. It hurt.
Well, what I've found over the years is that it could be helpful and important for us to talk about that. And that's why I wanted to check and see what you felt and how it went for you.
Thanks. I appreciate that. No one's ever done that for me before.
Yeah, I wondered if it was difficult for you when I didn't say many things at different times during the session.
Well, I did find that strange. I mean, you would go like really quiet, and she was clearly suffering, and aren't you therapists supposed to make them feel better?
Well, I wanted to share with you that I had a reason for not saying too much. Sometimes, if I do that, it cuts off the client's ability to process their feelings and get out their emotions. I have to make decisions moment to moment about what's best for the client. Right?
Okay, I guess that makes sense. I'm not a therapist, so I didn't know that, but I really appreciate your sharing, because that will help me for other therapy sessions. Thank you.
Well, now you already know this isn't meant to be a therapy session. But I think it's good for you to know that any human being working in this area can sometimes take strong feelings away with them. You might be driving home today or seeing a movie tomorrow, and suddenly you're remembering what happened today. That may be difficult for you, but it's really not unusual. I just wanted to alert you to that.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate that. Is there anything I should do?
I wanted to check in with you about the fact that I wanted to make sure you're taking care of yourself. Do you have a plan to take care of yourself if you develop strong reactions to our session with the client today?
Well, we got 20 minutes in self-care in our interpreter training, and they did tell us we should do something like that, but I have to admit, I got busy. I didn't make a plan.
Well, you better make sure you do get a plan, write it down, and we can talk about that next week, okay?
Thank you, Maria Jesus, instant therapist. Oh, isn't she wonderful? Thank you. I feel so much better now. A good debrief is not therapy. The therapist is never your therapist, but it can work wonders, and it reminds you, oh, that's right, I'm supposed to have a self-care plan. Oh, and a therapist may ask, so, you know, who are you going to talk to? Are you going back to work? Do you have another session? Maybe you might want to reconsider. Is there someone at your language company? In the United States, some language companies have counselors that on standby to debrief with, or if they're not professional counselors, they're at least people who have been trained to debrief. So the therapist can kind of explore if you're going to really take care of yourself. But that's as far as the therapist can go. So now, you were in pairs. You remember when you were working in two, you remember who you were working, right? Who you were working with. This time I'd like number 2 to be the interpreter for this role play. So you don't need the script. This is handout number 4. You don't need the script. All you need to do is make up answers just the way I did. I was just making it up as I went along. I didn't rehearse that. Make up the answers based on what the therapist is asking or telling you. Imagining you just had that really intense session where the survivor screamed out of nowhere, and where sometimes silence would fall and you didn't understand why the therapist wasn't doing something. That's all you have to do. The therapist reads the questions. That's number 2. And number 1, no script, just make up answers pretending that you were the interpreter for that session. Are there any questions about what I'm asking you to do? Any questions? Okay. Number 1, you can put the paper, number 2, you can put the paper down. The therapist is the only one who needs the paper. The therapist. Go. Debrief. Provided even for their telephone interpreters. Now, whether the interpreters feel brave enough to take advantage of that, not so often. And I was just speculating that perhaps it's because the interpreter doesn't want to look less strong or less professional. But taking care of yourself is a gift to the field of gender violence interpreting. So, now remember that handout, case studies, number 3? At this point, we should have answered the questions. So if you see anything on that sheet that we have not answered, now is your time to ask. I got a lot of questions I couldn't answer. And here was the one that really blew me out of the water, as we say in English. It really, I didn't even know what to say. So the question was this: Marjory, yes, so what do you do when the client is crying and the therapist is crying and you're crying? And I went something like, that's a really good question. And I went back to the executive director of the Torture Treatment Center and I said, we need specialized training for this, because if I can't answer these questions, I don't know an interpreter trainer around here who can. And so we ended up creating the nonprofit. Well, now back to your question. So the survivor is making an important breakthrough, and you begin crying too. You choke up so much it's hard to interpret. This is number 2, right? So is it wrong for you to cry? Oh, it's D. Is it all right to request a timeout? Yes or no, with your green for yes and your red for no. Okay, that's good, and I agree with the sea of green, but with one warning: how will you request the timeout? What do you mean, how? Are you just going to ask, can I have a break? You're going to tell the therapist I want a break? Or the lawyer or the social worker? Oh, how quickly we forget. I actually had a different suggestion. Yes. Like a little signal. It could be something as simple as this or this. Something that you prearranged because you're going to try and meet with the provider ahead of time. And why did I suggest that we had found it's better to do it that way than ask the therapist and report to the survivor that you asked for a break? Why is that important?
Porque la víctima no se tiene que dar cuenta que tú estás involucrada, o sea, que tú estás...
You're good. You're very good. That is exactly right. If you request the signal, you could be putting a burden, an emotional burden on the victim's already going through guilt and self-blame and why was I there at that time? Why did I do this? And oh, look how bad I'm making the interpreter feel. She can't take it either and she has to take a break. If you have, that's one reason. That's a very important reason. There's another, at least one other big reason.
So that you're not part of the process?
That is a good and important reason. It really is. But there's another huge one. And that's an excellent one. If you request it, you don't know if that's a good time. And you may be suffering, but you could hold out a little bit longer. If you alert the service provider, this is what they do for a living day in and day out. They know how to guide that person. If they're having a flashback, they're not going to interrupt. You're just going to have to tough it out until she can bring some closure to the experience. And if you don't, you could, in other words, if you interrupt at the wrong moment, you could re-trigger, as we say, or re-traumatize the survivor. So that's the importance. It was the therapist who suggested have a prearranged signal, but you could do that with any service provider, like a doctor who's doing a forensic medical exam for a survivor of torture for the asylum case. You could, the doctor may not be used to it, but the doctor can have a signal that you agree on.
Si yo necesito salir y salgo, y la víctima no se calla y sigue hablando, el terapeuta cómo entiende lo que le está diciendo.
Yeah, I'm not sure I understood that question. If you just have a signal that you are in distress, the therapist, especially therapists, but other service providers too, know that you're going to keep interpreting until the service provider calls for a break as soon as possible, and then you get out. Like I said, just, I need to get a glass of water so that you're alone and you can retake possession of yourself and decide if you're ready. So everyone will take a break. And if that means that the therapist is alone with the survivor, that's okay. You do not be alone with the survivor, but it's okay. And worst case scenario, they can pick up a telephone interpreter. It's said that your well-being is that important. They can deal with the silence. Does that answer your question? I just needed to be sure. Any other questions about, yes?
I have here in my mind, just 1 second. Okay, wouldn't both of them feel that you are drawing attention upon yourself as the interpreter?
If you make a discrete hand signal?
No, if you reveal that you're emotionally in distress, wouldn't that make them feel that you are slightly unprofessional? I'm just...
But I'm saying not to reveal that. I'm sorry I wasn't clear. I'm sorry, Dora. What I was trying to say is use your discrete signal so the survivor doesn't know, because only the provider knows that that signal means that you're in trouble. You're trying to master your body language and remain calm as you can, and so that the survivor doesn't know. Then they call the therapist or the social, whoever the service provider is, the doctor, the nurse, calls for a break and lets you leave, saying, why don't we all get a glass of water? Or interpreter, could you go and get us some water? Whatever, because that way the survivor doesn't know. So we both agree. I'm sorry I wasn't clear. Thank you for asking, because if you weren't clear, that means I wasn't clear for others. Any other questions about handout number 3 or anything else? Okay. Are you ready? We're going to take you through a much tougher role play. doing it exactly the way you did number 1. So you're back in your groups of 3. And this time, number 3 will play the interpreter. Number 2 will play the service provider, and number 1 will play the victim or survivor. For the first role play, and then there's a second role play where you can do whichever combination, whoever plays which role is up to you. But I'm warning you, this is a tougher role play, the first one. Any questions about the role play? Go for it. I'll wander around. If you have questions, I'm happy to answer your questions. Handout number 5, the rape in the car. She said, and what the victim said, the survivor. So it gives you a taste. One interpreter was just sharing with me, I know I can't do this. I'm going, this is a great learning outcome. It's good that you know here that you're not ready for that. But for those of you who are, and maybe there will be these opportunities through this project for specialized training, I want to come back and say what I said at the beginning, that this is an incredibly beautiful field, despite the violence, the despair, the darkness, because what is it about? It's about healing and justice. That's the work that you are engaged in as an interpreter. And you can look at my face, you can look at my body language, and know that I'm giving up virtually all my volunteer life and most of my discretionary time to this for joy, for the pure joy of this. And you can realize how fortunate you are to have Maribel and Doris and all the conference organizers and all the volunteers working together to make these experiences possible for you. So I also want to thank all the national volunteers and the Voice of Love and everyone who has also helped for this other project. The Victim Services Project is a training manual of over 250 pages, a workbook of exercises and role plays like this one, and PowerPoint slides and more that will be public domain because it's federally funded. And the Voice of Love is still deciding, do we sell the training manual, which will be ready this fall, to raise money for the nonprofit, or do we just make it publicly available? We don't know yet. So you will have opportunities for those of you who read comfortably in English, which would seem to be almost all of you, if not all of you, to learn more that way as well as through this magnificent project. I am available for questions except during this next presentation, which I really, really want to hear myself. And I wish from the bottom of my heart to all of you great good luck and fortune in your interpreting careers. Thank you so much for having me here.